Hi, I'm Len Epp from Lean Pub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Michael Plöd. Based in Nuremberg, Michael is currently working as a fellow for the technology and software development consulting firm InnoQ. Michael is an award-winning conference speaker, and he has over 15 years of consulting experience in areas like domain-driven design, and you can follow him on Twitter at BitBoss. Michael is the author of the Lean Pub book, Hands-on Domain-Driven Design by Example, Domain-Driven Design Practically Explained with a Massive Case Study. In the book, Michael explains domain-driven design, exploring a concept in each chapter from a theoretical level, coupled with a practical example and exercises derived from a sophisticated case and comprehensive case study. In this interview, we're going to talk about Michael's background and career, his professional interests, his book, Domain-Driven Design, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience as a self-published author. So thank you, Michael, for taking some time out from your evening to be on this episode of the Front Matter podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thanks for the invitation.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you became interested in technology.
Okay, that's a good question. I actually grew up in a mid-sized town called Regensburg, which is in Bavaria in Germany. And I basically spent all of my childhood there, went to school there, and I even studied information technology with a business focus in Regensburg. And after that, I wanted to leave Regensburg, so I went to London as a trainee for a bank and worked there a little bit, and then went back to Frankfurt and worked there for a bank. But I sooner or later realized that I'm more interested in doing consulting. So I joined a consulting company and worked as a consultant in the IT area on quite a few projects. And my interest in technology pretty much originated back as a kid. I was always fascinated with computers. A friend of my father, he worked at the university. And when we visited him at his office, I always, as a kid, wanted to see the big computers. And back in the days, like the data centers, basically a huge room was filled with one computer, which probably had a very small amount of the computing size compared to an iPhone nowadays. And I was always totally fascinated by those things. And sometime then after that, my parents got me a Commodore C64, and I was totally blown away by it. So I first started off with computer games, and what you do as a young kid growing up, you're fascinated with games and stuff. But sooner or later, I got some magazines, and I saw some listings with programs. So I started programming a little bit as a kid, and I think the first thing was a little game that I wrote in BASIC, where you had to answer some questions, just like a totally simple quiz, and that's how the ball got rolling. So when I was about to study after school, I had two things I considered. One option was to become a brewing master for beer in Bavaria. And the other one was information technology. So I checked out both things, and I decided to go for IT because I wasn't so much into chemistry and stuff like that. So, here I am now as an IT guy.
Yeah, I've got it.
Pretty typical story, I would say.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that story. That's great. So many people that I interview, because so many Lean Pub authors are technical people, have a story about their first encounter with a computer, and it's just so wonderful. And I've interviewed people, from across the decades, and it's just always so wonderful to hear about that first experience, and particularly the experience of, which is so dated now, but of getting a magazine. And a paper magazine and using that as your entry into programming. But before I ask you some questions about that, so one of the things I noted from your profiles online is that you're a fan of heavy metal music.
Absolutely.
And so this is a bit of a digression, but as I understand it, you founded a music magazine called All Schools.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about how that came about?
The fun thing is I started it over 20 years ago. I think it's now 22 years ago. And I started it with a friend of mine called Jochen Mader. And Jochen is now also, he's always been an IT guy. And we were members of the German hardcore punk scene back in the days. And it was quite an interesting time because many, especially in that area in Germany, many bands started to pop up. There was a lot about veganism, a lot of political stuff, and it was a very do-it-yourself driven scene. Yeah, everyone was doing a little bit. Yeah, some folks were starting bands, others started record labels, and others started merchandising companies or were printing T-shirts or flyers or something. I was on a total underground DIY level, and we thought, hey, what can we do? Nobody wants us in a band because we totally suck as musicians. And so we were like, hey, we're both technical guys. Let's start an online fanzine. Back in the days, there were a lot of print fanzines. And we were like, hey, let's start something online. And so we kicked that off. The funny thing is Jochen is now also a regular conference speaker. He works for a company called Instana, who are very active in the cloud space with their monitoring and analytics stuff. And we're still good friends. He left the magazine quite a few years ago, but I'm still active as a programmer for it and like the old guy in the background. And there's now quite a few folks in their 20s who write articles, and I'm happy to provide a platform for them to get started in that area.
Yeah, that's how
it went.
It's such a great story. I mean, it's the kind of thing we take it for granted now, but 22 years ago, having a site like that was an innovation and an achievement. And very early.
Yeah, I think we're probably, if you look at the German area now, I think we should be one of the oldest ones that are still active right now. Yeah.
One of the things I really enjoy about doing this podcast is interviewing authors from all over the world, and so I get to ask them about some of the things about where they're from. You're the first author from Nuremberg that I've interviewed, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about what's the tech and startup scene like there?
Nuremberg, there's many bigger corporations, and there's many big companies out there like large enterprises and stuff like that, and quite a big public sector kind of thing, an agency in Nuremberg, which is doing a lot in IT, and some mid-sized company. Yes, there are a couple of startups, but I wouldn't consider Nuremberg to be a big startup city or something like that. It's more, I would say, a very classical IT scene there. Yeah. We're from InnoQ. We're running the Software Architecture Nuremberg meetup, which is doing pretty well, but it's a typical, classical software architecture kind of thing. Of course, we do modern stuff like microservices and the current trends, but our audience is it's mostly folks from those corporations and enterprises.
Yeah, and work. I'm curious. I used to be an investment banker, and I was. And we'll talk a little bit about this. I was based in London, and did some work on deals in Germany. So I spent some time a little bit northwest of you in Frankfurt. And one of the curious features of working with people in big companies in Germany was the constraints. Compared to other places. Is that true? I mean, you're a consultant, but you work for a big company. I mean, are you sort of forced to leave the office at 5:30, or can you stay longer? Or I mean, I guess I'm sort of asking you, like, what's typical for someone working in a classical IT company in Germany? Are they sort of regimented like that?
I think it depends. I'm in a very lucky position that my employer is a very freedom-loving company, so I can basically do whatever I want as long as it's in reason. And But when I consult companies like that, yes, of course, you see some constraints depending hardware that they are allowed to use. And of course, there is something like a workers' council that takes a look if folks work more than 10 hours a day or something like that. But I would say most of the stuff is within good reason. Yeah, I mean, yes, of course, there are companies that are more regulated like others. Yes, there are some companies that have a very exciting environment. I think it always depends also, especially in the big corporations, in which kind of environment you work. For instance, I consulted an incubator, an insurance company a couple of years ago, and they had a totally awesome environment within this large enterprise. And that was totally great. And of course, other areas are not so great, but that's the life in a corporate enterprise. Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw it in London as well, and I've worked in London, as I said earlier, and I'm mostly I have a very strong banking background as well, so I think the difference is not that huge. Yes, there are nuances where the difference is, but I wouldn't say that's a huge difference.
And so you moved to London. What prompted that? Was it an easy decision, or did someone pull you there? Or was it a place you wanted to go?
Well, basically, it was part of the trainee program that I did at a German bank, and part of it was that the first placement was in London, and I heard that, and I thought, hey, that's great. I have never been to London before, but I only heard good things. And I was like, hey, you were in Regensburg for 25 years. Let's check this out. I mean, you can't lose with such a decision. You can only win checking out new places. And I loved London, and I still love this city.
If I can ask specifically, where did you live when you were there? What neighborhood?
My first apartment was a bank apartment in Westminster. And after that, I moved to Islington. But actually, I actually preferred Islington. It was near Angel Station.
Yeah, I actually lived on City Road, right near Angel Station, for a couple of years.
Ah, okay.
When I was working in the city myself. Yeah, it's sort of walking distance from the city was a key feature of living in that awesome neighborhood.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's a really good neighborhood over there. And since I love a lot of electro clubs and underground clubs, I always checked out the electro works and stuff like that. I was in walking distance, and I totally enjoyed that.
Oh yeah, I remember that place. Also, sort of spending distance.
It was a crazy place.
Yeah, also spending distance from Camden as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. That's cool. And so I guess what's the view in that context? I'm always curious because I got to go to London from Canada relatively easily. I got to study in the UK relatively easily. I imagine that when you went to London, it was, relatively easy, but that might not be the case going forward. I don't want to ask you to generalize to what's the German view of Brexit, but given that you've had this experience of living in the UK and being able to move and work there easily, what's your view of what's going on there right now?
I can't judge a lot about the English folks and their motivation, but my personal view is that this is utter nonsense. And I think I think the more that people collaborate, that they work together, that they see different views, the more they grow from it. And I think separation has served no one. I don't know one case in history where it served anyone. I think the most successful societies have always been the ones that, were open to other ideas. And I don't think that this is a good idea. And I think especially people who live in the bigger cities like London, Manchester, and so on, they see the benefits from such a collaboration and stuff. And they strongly voted against it. I mean, I don't want. I wish the British all the best. I really love that country, and I love the folks living there, and I think they can hopefully sort that out in a reasonable way. But it's pretty crazy what's going on right now, from my personal outside perspective, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Thanks for sharing those thoughts.
But it's their choice. I mean, they have the freedom to do that. It's part of democracy. Yeah, you need to accept decisions, even if you don't like them. But let's see. Let's hope we can. Yeah, all of us on the European continent can sort that out in a way that, it's kind of acceptable. But I think it's sad. Yeah, it's totally sad. Let's see.
Yeah, I share the same feelings. I think, particularly as someone who benefited from moving to someone else's country. I'm sympathetic to the view that people in that. So I moved to London. I went to the University of Oxford. I became an investment banker, and not everybody gets to have that kind of like you move to London and be a banker kind of thing. And I can see there's a sense, particularly in places where people are economically deprived, and they see foreigners coming into the country and making money and getting ahead, and see themselves falling behind. And it's very, very easy to think, oh, if it only weren't for those people, I'd be better off myself. And whether we agree with that view in a kind of socioeconomic theory, it's very common sense to see.
Yeah, I think it also has to do between the big difference between rich and poor that we now have, and that's also not a very good thing. And I think that needs to be addressed in one way or another. But I'm not a big specialist in those things, so I often refrain on offering simplified solutions, because reality is always complex, and it should be dealt with folks who know what they are doing.
On that note, thank you for the opportunity for a good segue. Speaking of complexity and things that you know what you're doing, you're an expert in domain-driven design, and you've written a book about it. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. What is domain-driven design?
Mm-hmm. Well, domain-driven design is an approach to develop software that reflects the heart of a business domain. It's a way that we write and we structure our software that the business domain is the heart of this. So that it reflects this kind of the rules. For instance, in the investment banking, when you do, let's say, some trading stuff, or you have certain rules how you want to judge real estates or something like that when you do a financing on them, and the way that and I would say domain-driven design has a very holistic approach to that. So it's not only about design patterns, how you write code, or it's actually not at all about technologies. It's more about also dynamics between various stakeholders. So how do developers and architects talk to domain experts? How can we crunch the knowledge together with them? How can we learn about them? What about the language? There's a very central thing, the ubiquitous language, which is a shared language that domain experts from the business speak and also the developers speak. And how do we get there? And there's a couple of techniques, ideas, and so on. And there, another author, Alberto Brandolini, who published the event storming book on LeanPub as well. He is a total specialist, for instance, in the domain-driven design company, especially for that knowledge crunching. And
I've got a few questions about some of these key concepts, including ubiquitous language and things like context maps. But before we move on, just to sort of drill right down. So every software, as Marc Andreessen said years and years ago now, is eating the world. And so the way software is made is actually the way our world is made. And this is actually one of the themes of our podcast. And we, fortunately, at Lean Pub, we get thinkers, like you and like Alberto Brandolini coming up who are saying like, we need to really think deeply. I mean, I know it's a part of your everyday world, but to the rest of us, it's often seems a bit distant. How is this software really being made? Can you just like let the computer guys take care of it is something that a lot of people have the attitude of. But actually the way software is built, the theories around it are driving the way our world works now. And so given that sort of framing, can you explain what a business domain is, maybe by giving us an example?
Yeah, let's say my case study, my book is based on a big case study around financing for retail mortgage loans. So if you buy an apartment or a house for your family, you need a loan from the bank. And one of the business domains is, for instance, mortgage loan lending. How do you apply for a credit? How does the bank judge your application when they get a quote from a credit agency that has information about your creditworthiness? How do they make the decision to grant the credit? What regulatory requirements do they have to meet and stuff like that? And that is basically a business domain. So it's basically a kind of a problem that we want to solve with IT. Yeah? And I want to grab one of your sentences there. Let the IT folks do that. Yeah, let's give them the thing, and let's do it. I think that doesn't work anyway. I think most products in today's world, as you said, software is eating the world, are digital, and I don't think that many business folks can resort to that attitude and think they can produce successful products in the future with that kind of attitude. I think they have to think in terms of IT products, digital products. In Germany, there's this term of Digitalisierung, like making everything digital. And I think I'm not a very big fan of that term, but the general idea is that everyone needs to understand that most of the stuff that we produce nowadays is basically IT.
Yeah, and particularly one of the inspirations behind domain-driven design is the idea of sort of, I mean, you have these great graphics about it, but a kind of Venn diagram where you try and find an efficient way of having an overlap between the business domain experts, let's say the person who's an expert in mortgage lending, and then the IT team that actually has to build the product. And part of the inspiration behind domain-driven design is the idea that these people should have some overlapping knowledge and even contact with each other, which is something that to an outsider might sound totally reasonable, but to insiders can sometimes seem alien and strange in a big enterprise because, for example, there might be, I forget what the term is, but there's requirements engineering team or something like that. That's in between these two groups, and like those people wouldn't have a job if they couldn't keep the two groups apart, or they might see it that way. So things like this that seem described at a high level as very common sense can actually be kind of like an existential crisis within an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the requirements engineering teams, their job is, or their classic job is, talk to the business folks and translate that stuff to IT slang. I always refer to the term IT slang. That's like the technical blabbering from the IT folks. And I think this leads to a couple of problems, especially if we have a very strong curtain, like an iron curtain between those two parts of an organization. Because sooner or later, the requirements engineering folks will derive their own business strategy going forward. And I think they are very helpful. Yeah, they are necessary. Yeah, they do a good job and they add a lot of value. But I think there needs to be a direct communication between technical people and domain experts, and maybe the requirements. Yeah.
And why is it conventional to want to keep the domain experts and the IT people apart?
There's no really good reason for doing that. I think it's a habit in a lot of organizations that this is happening. and it has grown to be convenient, for many folks. Hey, let the IT handle that. Oh, the business people, it's so hard to deal with them. Please write down the requirements and attitudes like that. And it has worked in a couple of organizations, especially when they didn't need a high pace in terms of new product development, product updates. But nowadays, speed is everything. The ones that move faster are probably the ones that learn faster and that gain a bigger market share.
And the question of language is one that comes up often. I'm in, as researching for this interview, and I know there's this specific concept of ubiquitous language. I just wanted that we can talk about. I just wanted to bring up one of your great jokes in a talk that you gave, I think, late last year, where you talk about how, if you've got an image of a room and there's a window, a sort of domain expert in rooms might call it a window, but then a technical person might call it like a transparency pane.
Yeah.
And the carpet.
A transparent. What was it? Transparency creation device or something like that.
Yeah. And then you can just imagine, a couch would be a sort of resting device or something like that. Anyway, that often. One of the things that just makes it so hard for people to talk to each other is that they don't have a shared language, and part of domain-driven design is establishing a shared ubiquitous language. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you actually accomplish that. How do you get people to talk on the same terms?
Mm-hmm. I think it has to do a lot with empathy, and empathy going both ways. So on the one hand, that the IT folks go ahead and toss away all their graphical UML whatnot tooling that they usually use for modeling or analyzing things, and that the business folks go ahead and say, okay, let's talk to the IT. Let's get the ball rolling and let's talk. And I think it's a lot about this common ground so that everyone meets at eyes level. Of course, the IT folks are better in abstracting things, structuring things. But it would be very short-sighted to ignore the knowledge from the business folks and the experience that they have. And
I wanted to ask you about how you go about establishing a ubiquitous language between the people with the business domain expertise and the IT side of things.
I think a lot of it has to do with empathy. And empathy going both ways. So on the one hand, we have the domain experts that need to have, that need to be willing to talk to IT people. On the other hand, we have the IT folks that they ditch a lot of their technical slang and their technical tooling. Yeah, I've witnessed a couple of times that there was a knowledge crunching meeting and someone was starting up a huge enterprise scale UML modeling tool. And the business folks came in and the IT people said, hey, let's draw an activity diagram or a use case diagram. And the business folks were like, what? Never heard of that? What, you never heard about that? And this doesn't work. And there are a couple of techniques now in the domain-driven design community. They all revolve around knowledge crunching, and most of them actually are workshop methods like event storming, domain storytelling, example mapping, user story mapping, or impact mapping, or something like that. And they all are inclusive workshops. Everyone can participate in them. And it's mostly about not technical workshops. You work a lot with flip charts, with Post-its, sticky notes, and stuff like that. And they create a common ground for communication. Yes, there is no formal model coming out of them, but there is a lot of learning happening in them. And this learning and this exploration then needs feeds into a common and a shared language, which is then the base for a domain model which is represented in code and documentation and graphics and stuff like that.
You mentioned event storming. So
Yes.
is that if I understand? I'm not sure I understand exactly how that works, but and I should. But it sort of comes from brainstorming, right? And the idea is that you're looking at a past event and kind of
Exactly.
breaking down what happened and what you can do to improve things going forward.
Yeah, exactly. So let's say you want to create a product where you want to file a car claim for a car insurance over a smartphone. Everyone in the room, when you want to explore that business domain, everyone in the room knows that the last thing that happens in this is that someone has filed the complaint successfully. And from there, you can move along. Hey, what do we need for a successful complaint? Oh, someone must have uploaded a photo. They need to upload the police report, and they need to provide an insurance number of the counterparty, and things like that. And you explore that, and you put those events on a modeling space, which is a huge roll of paper on a wall, and you start exploring things based on stuff that happened. And that's a totally simple concept, and it often ignites a lot of discussion and also explorations. Oh, I never thought about that special case like this. And hey, that's a very interesting insight there. We never saw that. And yeah, it's a really efficient way of crunching down knowledge about business rules and domains and problems.
You've got a really interesting example of that you talk about in this talk I referenced earlier that I saw on YouTube, where if you give the guys whose goal is, or the people whose goal is to convert people, sort of control of what a sign up form looks like, it'll be really simple because they'll want to ask as few things as you can, low touch as possible to get people through. If you ask, particularly in the institutions that it sounds like you've done a lot of work with, like financial institutions, the risk guys, if they could make that form would be 100 pages long.
10 pages, yeah.
Or 10 pages long.
Absolutely, yeah.
And is it in discussions like this where you bring those two groups together that people can finally kind of see, now I understand why the requirements have been coming down to me this way, or why there's,
Yeah, that's an option to do. Yes, and it's a lot about power dynamics in organizations. So who can have an influence on whom? Yeah, who can demand that the application form is not just 5 fields, which are totally optimized for conversion rates, but that it's actually 40 fields that are driven by regulatory requirements and risk demands in order to drive the credit risk of the bank down.
Yeah, that reminds me actually. So I wanted to ask you about context maps, because I think people sort of people coming from something towards something like this from an IT perspective or from a sort of stereotypical IT perspective might not appreciate actually the complexity that a context map is meant to capture. You just reminded me of something. I believe it was Gregor Hoope who wrote about the elevator, riding the elevator. And I don't know if it was him, because I interviewed him for this podcast, and there was someone else I interviewed who was also a chief software architect for a giant financial institution. But they talked about, like, somebody's got to be able to be Geordie LaForge, and have that role where they can understand what's going on in engineering, but they've got to have that be able to ride the elevator to go talk to Captain Picard and actually communicate to him what's important and, priorities and things like that. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you would, in a practical sense, go about creating a context map that includes the politics, like you're just bringing up. Yeah. Who's influential? I mean, do you literally, if you're undergoing the exercise of creating a context map in domain-driven design, do you actually have an org chart and draw connections between people and areas of influence and things like that?
I usually don't address that from an org charts perspective. Well, me personally, other folks might do that. I usually, I think it depends on what your starting point is. One starting point, and this is a very classical domain-driven design thing that's also part of the existing literature is that you map an existing system or an existing landscape, application landscape with this. Then I obviously look at the stakeholders that are around on the software. I look at the integration between teams and systems, and then I pick the folks whom I want to talk to. I personally think that you can also use the context map in a greenfield approach when you want to create something new. Who can raise requirements on whom? Or whom do we want to just tell, hey, you just take what you get, and that must be sufficient for your product. You can't raise any bigger requirements because we want to be able to move fast. And if we have an endless governance going around, we will have a perfect governance, but we will be slow. And that's a typical it depends kind of thing. But I personally consult org charts, but they can be a valuable thing. Maybe I'm doing it wrong by not consulting them. I don't know. I think those power dynamics are something that are especially interesting. If I take Gregor's amazing analogy with the elevator, which I totally like, they are very interesting for the upper levels of the organization and of the skyscraper that he's talking about. I think Gregor talked about if you're able to make the folks in the penthouse on the upper floors interested in some details from the engine room, from the machine room, then you're doing a good job as an architect. I think that's his quote as far as I know.
And what is domain storytelling? I found that concept really fascinating.
Yeah. Domain storytelling is also a knowledge crunching technique, which revolves around sentences. Yeah? Subject, predicate, object. An applicant fills out a loan application form. So, and you draw those sentences in a pictographic language. In comparison to event storming, domain storytelling is forward-oriented. It's not backward-oriented with the events in the past tense. It's mostly forward-oriented in the present tense. So someone draws, someone hands in something, someone files a report or something like that. And I think it's also a very interesting thing because it's very... with the pictographic language, you visualize stories that are happening in a business domain. And this is a very helpful thing. I very often actually combine event storming and domain storytelling together. I start off with event storming, and after that, the knowledge that has been gathered in the 2 or 4 or 6 hours of the workshop, I consolidate that with domain storytelling so that everyone has a visualization of what we have just discussed. It's a very interesting thing coming very strongly from the German domain-driven design community, from Henning and Carola and Stefan from a company called WPS. And I think that's a very interesting concept, and I really like working with that a lot.
One concept that I confess kind of ultimately eluded me when I was researching for this was the bounded context.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, in the style of your book, from a sort of theoretical level, and then with a kind of practical example of what a bounded context is.
Yeah, I think if the bounded context wouldn't exist, I wouldn't have my book right now, and we wouldn't be talking. I think actually, domain-driven design is a really old thing. It's 15 years old now, so it's a very, very old theory in the IT space, which is quite rare because it's a very fast-paced environment. And the bounded context led to domain-driven design being very popular nowadays because one trend in IT nowadays are microservices, which are very smaller independent systems, which are mostly mapped around on the Bezos to PISA team, and a team can design it, they can develop it, they can roll it out to production. And that's a very strong trend in IT architecture nowadays. And a lot of the folks from the microservices community often refer to the bounded context from domain-driven design with regards to the question, how do we cut those microservices? How do we design them? What's their granularity? What's their size? And a rough rule of thumb is one bounded context should be one microservice. And basically the bounded context is a decentralization of a domain model. Now, back in the days, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, we built very large, very big, very clunky systems, and they revolved around a very big central domain model that had its advantages. Yeah, it was very consistent. There was not a lot of repetition. Reuse, don't repeat yourself. Those were the principles that drove those things. Those are the advantages, but the disadvantage is it makes you slow. Yeah, because when you change something in the big central thing, everyone else needs to change as well. So you have a lot of coordinated releases, and by breaking down this big domain model into smaller pieces that are highly specialized for certain business capabilities, you decentralize your domain model basically. And this is what the bounded context is about. The bounded context is, in one sentence, the boundary around the meaning of a model and the boundary around the ubiquitous language. So the ubiquitous language is mostly valid. It's a linguistic boundary. It's valid in one bounded context. And this is the key driver for many modern IT trends, such as self-contained systems, microservices, and things like that. And that's the key driver for the popularity of domain-driven design nowadays. And also the organizational aspects, of course, that go hand in hand with it.
So would this just to think about, like, if I were sort of like given the task, go define a bounded context, would that, for example, be like, let's say we were doing someone submitting a mortgage application. Would you define a bounded context around, say, the credit score, getting the credit score, and would that be one kind of bounded context, and then another one be the risk assessment?
What I think is one bounded context is obviously filling out the form, because this is a business capability that revolves around many, let's say, e-commerce metrics, such as conversion rate, where to sales. That's basically a sales funnel, so to say. Yeah. When do they leave the checkout? Yeah. Stuff like that. It's extremely driven at the consumer. It needs to be blazing fast. It needs to have the best UX, and it's basically the key domain model in there is the loan application form. And another thing is then the scoring of the whole application. Yeah, you have a real estate assessment going in. Yeah, there may be a quote from a credit agency about the creditworthiness of the applicants, and there are a couple of rules in there that derive points that define some knockout criteria, such as, let's say, the monthly surplus of the household is negative, and no one would grant a credit for such a situation, obviously. This is a totally different business capability. And I would encapsulate that into its own bounded context, because it lives by its own rules. It has a very sophisticated, very risk-driven and not e-commerce-driven model. And
So I think I'm starting to understand a little bit better. So that this way, for example, if you're in a team that's working on a product, maybe even a huge one, and you define these bounded contexts, would you then sort of like have individual persons or little internal teams go off and work within a bounded context themselves?
Yes.
So they understand how it all. Once these bounded contexts have been defined, then people know what they're working on, and they know how it fits in with the other things that other people are working on.
It's I think one bounded, the ideal setting. Yeah, I'm very well aware that the real world is not always ideal, but the ideal setting would be you have one team which is responsible for one bounded context. So, because if one team would share two bounded contexts, the team always speaks the same language. So they would grow together from a linguistic perspective.
Oh, yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, if you have two teams sitting on one bounded context, this bounded context would drift apart in terms of the language. Yeah? And those are things you should keep in mind when you do those cuts. I think you need to consult a couple of or you need to look at it from different perspectives, like organizational perspectives, quality criteria, domain models, processes, and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think I might have mentioned this in a recent episode, but one of the I don't come from a programming background, and one of the interesting experiences I've had being part of LeanPub is seeing the way terms can become conflated. And so there's one particular term that we have in LeanPub that has a very sort of specific meaning in our code, but is a normal English word that also refers to something that we present people with that they can use on LeanPub. And those two things can actually become confused. And sort of in a sense, it kind of leaks out from the programming side into the user side, the use of this term in a way that's very confusing to users because it doesn't mean to a user what it means to someone coding in the LeanPub code base and vice versa. And so if I'm sort of trying to communicate to, the team, something that's coming from users using the same term, they often get derailed because they're like, oh, you don't understand. In the code, it means this. And it's like, no, I perfectly understand that in the code it means that, but I'm telling you that the same word also has this other meaning. And obviously I make my mistakes and sort of in interpretation as well, because there's this inherent problem with the conflation of terms. So what you said about how people, if the same team is working on two bounded contexts at the same time, the way their language will actually end up being confused.
Absolutely.
Potentially. Because they are themselves conflating different activities in their own work. Just before we move on to the next part of the interview, you mentioned there's no such thing as an ideal world, and that reminded me of this delightful phrase about programming that I think it might be the same friend you mentioned earlier has, which is that a programmer should be like a werewolf, afraid of silver bullets.
Yeah, that's a quote from Jochen Mader, who founded the music magazine with me. He wrote that on Twitter, and I really like that attitude because there are no silver bullets. It's all trade-offs, and never become a blind guru for something. It doesn't make sense. Always find suitable solutions that help you and your customers, and you're not getting paid for for applying everything blindly that's in, for instance, a domain-driven design book or some other programming book. You're paid to solve problems, and that should be your priority. And I always use that term as a disclaimer in every single one of my conference talks, that nothing I'm telling the folks is a silver bullet.
Yeah, I think it's such a great thing, and it works from all sorts of perspectives, including from the sort of, I guess one might say the sort of stereotypical kind of C-suite perspective, where it's kind of like, I brought this up a little earlier, and you mentioned it too, but why can't the computer guys just solve that problem and tie it off with a little bow and make it go away? And it's because the world doesn't work like that.
No.
It just doesn't. Moving on to the next part of the interview, I wanted to ask you about your book. What and the process of being an author. So why did you choose to write on LeanPub? I guess is the first question I have about that.
First of all, I'm sort of it goes back to the music background to a certain degree. I basically grew up in a very do-it-yourself-driven community as a kid, and this is something that I still value a lot. And by publishing or by choosing self-publishing, I can work on my own rules. I can write the book the way that I want it. I can adjust the schedule the way that I want it. And so basically it helped me really good. So last year, I wasn't so much into writing, and I'm very honest. I prefer doing conference talks over writing because I don't consider myself to be the best writer around, and so I always need to push myself to writing. And the working mode with self-publishing really helped me. So at the end of the year, I actually had my stuff together, and I wanted what I knew what I really wanted this book to be, and it went totally fast after that. So basically, the self-publishing thing helped me a lot with my way of working. And on the other hand, I also have to say, I write a very specialized book. My book is not meant to be a bestseller, which is standing in any airport or any big bookstore or something like that. So if I would go to a classic publishing company, it would be sold online anyways. So I thought that this is basically a very modern and a very good way to publish nowadays. And also from a royalties perspective, it is absolutely attractive, I must say. I'm not writing the book for the royalties, to be honest. It's more a thing that I thought I need to have a book out, and it's a topic I'm passionate about. But on the other hand, when you as an author get paid a fair deal, and you can dynamically adjust the pricing the way you want it, you can release the way you want it, you don't have to discuss your marketing or anything with folks from a big company. That's the way of working that I just prefer.
And you're publishing your book in stages, which is really interesting. And you've projected them out very explicitly, including the fact that you're going to be raising your prices over time.
Yes.
Did you come up with that model on your own? Did you borrow it from somewhere else?
It was a lot of I think logical thinking. I put myself into a reader or a customer perspective there with regards to that. First of all, and also Jürgen Aleppo, who's a well-known author around management stuff, once wrote a blog why he's not publishing on LeanPub or something like that, because he doesn't believe that people read incomplete books. And I thought Jürgen has a certain point here. And I wouldn't want to read a chapter which is in itself incomplete, and I need to reread it again and again and again in order to get the updates. So from that kind of perspective, I thought, yeah, that's totally valid from a customer perspective or from a reader perspective. So I chose to publish complete chapters that are edited, that are spell checked, and that are content complete, and where only some smaller refinements or something like that come in, like a typo that I oversaw, or some smaller adjustments only. So I think, and my approach to that is, if you buy the book now, and I have a traffic accident and I die tomorrow, you would still have something that is worth the price and that is consistent as a product. And when I do the next release, it contains more, but it's always a consistent product that I'm releasing. And the more the product grows, the more expensive it gets. And I value the readers that stepped in early, that put their trust in me at an early stage, and so they get it cheaper. And the others that follow after that, they have to pay a little bit more. But I think with the variable pricing on LeanPub, you still have a very fair choice.
Yeah, just to explain to people listening who might have sort of not quite caught that, one of the features of buying a LeanPub book is that you get all the future updates for free, so that
Yes.
You don't. When we talk about the price going up over time as chapters are added, that doesn't mean that you have to pay. You have to
No.
pay more for the new chapters.
Yeah, no.
It means so. What Michael's saying is that and this is actually something that quite a few LeanPub authors have done is you reward someone for being an early adopter of your book by having the price be lower when you first publish it, and then they get all the future chapters for free. But when the book is complete, then if someone's buying it for the first time, the price might be higher for them than it would have been if they bought it earlier on in the process. With respect to what you're talking about how publishing incomplete chapters, that's a very good point, and it's something that LeanPub authors tend to not do. They more or less adopt the same approach that you do, which is like after you've got enough complete chapters, publish the first version of your book, and then when you publish new versions, I mean, aside from typo corrections and stuff like that, I mean, you can publish 100 new versions of a LeanPub book in a day if you want, without bothering anybody, just sort of in the background doing the gardening or whatever. But when you do a new release, a sort of formal release, that's when you've added like one or more new complete chapters.
Exactly.
And when you're a reader, when you want to get on board is sort of more or less contingent on your some combination of your taste and your needs. So, for example, if you really need to learn, if your boss has given you some task and you really need to learn something new, if a book is 30% complete, you're like, bring it on. I want it right now. I don't want to wait for random author's random publishing schedule until it's 100% complete. Like I want as much information as I can get right now. And so people like that are happy to jump on board early on in the process. My second last question is interacting with readers important to you? Is that something that you've been doing a lot, with people emailing you with typo suggestions and things like that?
I didn't get a lot of feedback in terms of typos, but I actually built up an audience throughout the last 1.5 years very proactively. So I think I had a very high number of readers who registered on LeanPub who said they would buy the book. And I started advertising for the book actually over a year ago. And I worked towards building up an audience, and I'm very interactive with the biggest part of my audience on Twitter. Actually, Twitter is probably my most important channel for the interaction. And some folks write me emails, others drop me a tweet, that's the way I work. And I'm always happy for feedback. No book in this world is perfect. No author is perfect. And we all have our very own perspective. And I'm always curious in hearing other perspectives. Maybe I didn't see something or learn something through my consulting so far, but some other person has. And that's something I'm always very interested in.
My last question, and the one I usually use to close out the podcast, is if there was one thing we could build for you or one thing we could fix for you on LeanPub, what would you ask us to do?
Currently, I think since I'm currently on the very old contract, I signed up before the subscription thing. The templates for printing are kind of limited, but I think there is a solution for that. And other than that, I think the tracking where the sales are coming from. That's something I would be very interested in. And I posted a question on that on the forum a couple of days ago. So when you run AdWords campaigns, when you buy a slot on the shelf, how do you measure that? And I think you can't see that right now. And that would be very interesting from a marketing perspective, where you spend your marketing money for the books. In terms of the editing with the markdown stuff, I'm totally happy, but I'm not doing any crazy stuff there. And that, for me personally, totally works out. But the tracking of purchases, where they are coming from, how you steer your marketing, that's something I would be very interested to see more sophisticated features.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for that suggestion.
For instance, adding Google Tag Manager tags to a successful checkout. Yeah, when you run an AdWords campaign.
Can you say
for the tag manager of Google? When you run an AdWords campaign, you could inject a little snippet to the checkout page so that you see this purchase came from an ad,
right?
Yeah, or something like that. That purchase came from the shelf. I didn't buy a shelf spot yet because my book is not complete yet, and I may reserve that to a later stage. But I would be very interested in seeing, is that a successful measure for me, or is it not?
Yeah, thanks very much.
Or are Google Ads a good investment, or is the shelf better? I mean, everything is possible.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. We've had a couple of other requests along those lines recently.
Yeah.
And for anyone listening, if you're a Google Analytics expert, please go on the LeanPub Authors Forum and answer Michael's question. Updating Google Analytics is something that is on our plan of things to do.
Yes.
And improving analytics generally, and just sort of transparency, because it's sort of like there's all kinds of like hard-nosed reasons to do that. If you're being a self-published author, you're running a business, you've got a product. But also there's something around motivation that everyone knows analytics helps with as well, right? And just curiosity and engagement and knowing where to put your attention, or knowing about new avenues for attention is something that, we do want LeanPub to be more of an environment with things like that going on in it. That help you basically reach more readers and sell more books. Well, thank you very much, Michael, for taking the time to do this interview and for using LeanPub as the platform for your book. Best of luck. It's been a success so far, and I'm sure it will be going forward.
Yeah, it exceeded all my expectations. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks. And thanks, as always, to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to us on iTunes if you haven't done so already, and leave a review. It really does help. And if you'd like to become a LeanPub author yourself, either writing a book or creating a course, please go to leanpub.com and click Why LeanPub. Thanks.